Good afternoon, everyone. This is Swapna Liddle, and on behalf of the India International Center, I welcome you to this very exciting talk and webinar on art and history, texts, contexts, and visual representations in ancient and medieval India, in early medieval India, sorry. And this is also actually the title of this very interesting book, which has been edited by Professor R. Mahalakshmi, Professor, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. The subject is one that should be of interest to a large number of people. It's the background behind this kind of work is really some discussions that have been happening. In fact, as in a very personal, private capacity, we've been having these discussions, Mahalakshmi and I, might also over the years, of how historians don't often adequately deal with visual material. And when I say that they don't look at visual material, I mean this in two senses. One, of course, is that they probably don't consider them enough. And maybe these are we tend to look at other kinds of sources and often overlook visual material in many of the historical contexts that we are in fact examining. And even when there are visual sources, whether they are sculptures or they are paintings or any other kinds of visual material, we tend to overlook it unless one is doing a specific study of those. So that is one aspect, one way in which historians have probably not looked at visual material enough. The other sense in which I would say that they haven't looked at visual material enough is literally in the very, very, very obvious way of actually seeing, and have not seen visual material because we have allowed or let art historians or other kinds of commentators on art to tell us what a particular painting, a particular sculpture, a particular building, what it means, to tell us what that means. We haven't actually looked at it ourselves in a very, very physical sense of looking. And therefore, I feel that this kind of a talk of looking at visual material, to taking it into account, and necessarily the way that a historian looks at a visual at visual evidence like this, whether it is sculpture or a building, architecture, painting, has to be different because historians come with a different background, a different discipline, and it is high time, I think, that that they venture into these areas more. And therefore, this kind of a work, edited volume with several essays on themes related to this, is very welcome as an effort in this direction. And I hope that much more will come of this. And in the meanwhile, I would, of course, welcome Professor Mahalakshmi I look forward to hearing from her. Before I go on any further, I would like to very briefly introduce our other speakers for this evening. We will have two discussants for this webinar. We have, and who will be talking about this book and their impressions of it. Professor Shyam Narayan Lal, who's Professor and Director, Center for History and Culture for Jammu and Ladakh, University of Jammu. And then Professor Prabhat Basant, Professor, Department of History and Culture, Faculty of Humanities and Languages, Jamia, Millia, Islamia. So I welcome you all, Mahalakshmi, Shyam Lal, Prabhat Basant, to this afternoon session, which I'm sure will be absolutely lovely. Before we start off, before Mahalakshmi launches into really the meat of the webinar, her main talk, I have a couple of requests from those of you who are joining in here, who are joining this webinar. I would request you all, if you have any questions, please post them, and we will pass them on to the we will take them up at the after the speakers have spoken, and we can continue the discussion that way. And I think now I will ask Mahalakshmi very soon to speak, but before that, I want all of us speakers to show you the book. Sorry, mine has gone off. Nowadays, we all have them in different formats. Mine is on my Kindle. And we all have them in different, but we all have them and we've all enjoyed it thoroughly. So I look forward to this afternoon, and I welcome Mahalakshmi to give her talk about this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swapna, Dr. Liddle. It is indeed a privilege to have you chair this and moderate this session. I'm extremely grateful to the India International Center for organizing this book discussion in the format of a webinar. It was really a great disappointment. This book came out in late December 2019, and I was looking forward to actually having an offline book discussion. In fact, I had mentioned it to people in the India International Center and elsewhere, but the events of the past year meant that one could not do all that one had planned. But nevertheless, a webinar is possibly, a more a better way to reach out to a large audience, and ultimately we want to reach out to large audiences when we write our books. So it's really a privilege and a pleasure for me to be here to talk about this book, a book that is very close to my heart because it raises and flags issues that I had been interested in for a fairly long period of time. I'm particularly thankful to Ms. Lal Som Liani Tokchung and to Ms. Omita Goyal of the India International Center for giving me this space to talk about this book. The interesting thing about a book like this is that without you even knowing it, you are actually planning it over a very, very long period of time. And then there comes a time when you finally are able to put things together. So I began in my doctoral work to look at visual representations very seriously because I was looking at the making of goddess traditions in the Tamil region. I was looking at the process of cult formation, assimilations, particularly of the local goddesses within the Shiva traditions. And it is in that context that I really began to think about the visual representations, just because you have an abundance of visual material available, an abundance of monuments available belonging to that broad time period that I was studying, which is the early medieval period spanning the dynastic rule of the Pallavas, the Pandyas, and the Cholas. So it's in that sense that I was really very, very drawn to the visual material. And one of my teachers and my mentor, Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay at the Center for Historical Studies, was one of those who insisted that one should actually look more closely and look, in fact, in other contexts as well, in other regions as well, on visual representations in the manner in which I had engaged for my doctoral thesis. So that was really a turning point, a starting point. And when I joined the Center for Historical Studies, it was something that led me to teach courses on art and architecture, as well as on religion and society in early India. And in these courses, I tried to bring together some of the ideas that come up in this book. What is also very important for me is that a number of my students, my research students, I've been fortunate to have very, very bright and engaged students who submitted their dissertations and theses with me, and from whom I have learned tremendously, who have also focused on visual material. And so really this is the culmination of all of that learning, all of that engagement with art and history. As far as defining visual art is concerned, this very profound understanding comes from a prehistorian, an archaeologist who is really one of the pioneers in this subspecialization called cognitive archaeology, called Stephen Mithun, where he talks about how with human evolution and the evolution of the brain, the enlargement of the brain, and so on, there were certain capacities that were developed in humans. But it is not until we come to the Homo sapiens sapiens that we really see the cognitive capabilities as coming together, the processes of cognition that we see related to mental conceptualization of an image, which was possibly there earlier, the ability to communicate in a form that is meant to be understood by others. So an intentionality that is there as far as that communication is concerned. And the third aspect being that some kind of a meaning, some kind of a symbolic structure, some kind of a signification that comes about through this kind of visualization, which we refer to as the visual arts. That this is something that really comes up in the prehistoric period. It comes up with the evolution of the Homo sapiens sapiens. It emerges at a time when we are really capable of integrating these three separate kinds of cognitive processes, but all three of them perhaps existing in some form or the other earlier, but actually coming together at this point of time. And since then, what we find is that visualizations, visual art forms, and so on, and from that time period itself, actually, rather than since then, from that time period itself, we find that there is a cultural contiguity. There is a certain specific focus which we can see, which relates to the way in which a community understands itself. So its understanding of a concept that is being conveyed, its understanding of the intention, in fact its conceptualization itself is contingent upon that particular culture. So this is a very, very important understanding that has really allowed those of us who are interested in art history, art and history, art in history, to think a little more carefully about the ways in which meanings and symbols and ideas get conveyed through art. Coming to a much later period, coming to the Indian subcontinent, a 7th century text, a very important text on art called the Vishnu Dharmotar Puran, has this very interesting conversation in the Tritiya Khanda, in chapter 2, where you have this king called Vajra who is asking the sage Markandeya for advice, for knowledge. And Vajra says, Devata Rupa Nirmanam Kathayasva Mamanagah Yasmat Sannihita Nityam Shastravat Akritir Bhavet. And Markandeya replies, Chitra Sutram na janati yastu samyan naradhipa pratima lakshanam vettu na shakya te na karichit. And then Markandeya goes on to say, Vinatu nritta shastrena chitra sutra suddurvidam jagato anukriya karya dvayorapi yato nripa. And further, he says, Na Geetena Vina Shakyam Yatumato Dyumachyut Geeta Shastra Vidyanagya Sarve Vetti Yatha Vidhi. What is this conversation? Vajra is asking, he says, O sinless one, speak to me about the making of images of deities so that the deity may remain always close by and may have an appearance in accordance with the Shastras. And Markandeya replies, O Lord of men, he who does not know properly the rules of Chitra can by no means be able to discern the characteristics of images. And then Vajra again asks, O propagator of the race of Bhrigu, be be pleased to narrate the rules of painting, as he who knows the rules of painting alone knows its characteristics in words. And Markandeya says, without a knowledge of the art of dancing, the rules of painting are very difficult to be understood. Hence, no work of this earth, O king, should be done even with the help of these two, for something more has to be known. And what is that something more? You have to know the rules of Gita or music. So clearly seeing different aspects of art, of creative expression as being interrelated, the Vishnu Dharmottara Puran is actually talking about how important it is for the visual arts and for the performing arts to be understood in sync with one another, as being related to one another, the rules of these as being very closely related, because of particularly that point that Stephen Mithun was raising, that cognitive process that we are looking at, where the mental conceptualization, the communication, and the meanings and symbols that we read from these can only be understood when you look at the totality of art production, because all of it is coming from a particular cultural tradition. So it's in that sense that it's very, very important for us to look at these interrelated aspects, even while we look at specific kinds of themes or particular forms of art when we look at particular historical contexts. Now, art has been compared to a cryptogram. It has in fact been called a cultural cryptogram by E.H. Gombrich, this very well-known scholar on art history. His wonderful work, Art and Illusion, will be known to most scholars working on art history. And he draws our attention to how in the Greek and Western traditions in particular, the understanding was of art mirroring reality. You have Plato talking about art being quite suspicious of art, really. Aristotle talking about mimesis as being very central to art. And while they were primarily focusing on the dramatic tradition, the performative arts, this was seen as being also quite relevant when we are looking at other art forms, the visual arts specifically. Ananda Kumaraswamy was one of those savants, those pioneering scholars writing in the early 20th century, who engaged with this kind of art theorization that was coming out in the West. He was trained in the West, and he also came to understand and to appreciate Indian art traditions, primarily because of the kind of framing of ideas that he gained in that location. And in Kumaraswamy's understanding, rather than see art as simply being, representation, one needs to understand art as a rhetoric, art as something that gives effectiveness to truth. And that effectiveness can be done in so many different ways, where an aesthetic is involved, where a certain stylization is involved, where certain other ideas, certain other requirements come to bear upon the way in which art is actually presented. And then you have various other scholars like Walter Benjamin who draw our attention to how actually art is it is constrained by society, by social parameters of taste and style. Benjamin is one of those who celebrates modern art because it breaks those social barriers and social constraints. But Benjamin, when talking of pre-modern art, does talk about the aura, the authority that art has because of its location in a particular social and cultural context. So it's in that sense that these are very, very important works for me and for those whom I have been talking to and whom I have learned from in relation to understanding why it is so important for us to study art as a part of historical process. And amongst the pioneering scholars whom one needs to look towards for a better understanding of Indian art in particular, we have Stella Kramrish and Ananda Kumaraswamy, Indophiles. Stella Kramrish coming to India, reading the Bhagavad Gita, getting trained by an Aghori, or getting initiated, by an Aghori, and really completely immersed in the spiritual traditions. And for both Kramrish and Kumaraswamy, it is that spiritual mooring of Indian art that needed to be tapped by any scholar who was trying to study and arrive at some kind of understanding and derive meanings from that art. And here, again, going back to that wonderful text, Vishnu Dharmottara Purana, at a later point of time, the conversation continues between Vajra and Markandeya, where Markandeya keeps advising him on colors, on form, on style, technique, and so on. And there's this one point when we are talking about images for deities, when Vajra says, Rupa Gandha Rasair Hinam Shapta Sparsha Vivarchita Prushastu Tvaya Proktastasya Rupamida Katham. And Markandeya says, Pravriti Vikritis Tasya Dve Rupa Paramatmana Alakshya Tasya Tadrupa Prakriti Sa Prakritita. And essentially what he's trying to say here is, Vajra asks, how can one who is formless, one who does not emanate any smell, who is devoid of taste and cannot be discerned through words or touch, how can he possibly be known? And Markandeya answers, the form which is difficult to perceive through specific characteristics is Prakriti, or original nature. Thereby, the whole universe itself is to be understood as Pravriti, or manifestation, through Vikriti, or modification. And thus, we are able to arrive at Rupa, or form. So very, very important, textual knowledge and engagement with this issue of how do we actually depict, if in the Indian art traditions, there seems to be an enormous amount of art production related to gods and goddesses and divine beings, which were meant to be housed in temples, which were found on the walls of temples. And even when they are not in temples, you have sculptural representations of gods and goddesses which were prescribed. And then how do we actually imagine, how do we actually conceptualize these gods and goddesses? And you have in a text like Vishnu Dharmottara Purana such advice that is being given of how one can actually understand this. The way in which the textual material that a large number of these scholars like Kramrish and Kumaraswamy, and scholars writing much later on, continuing even today, use primarily the religious texts, primarily the Shilpa Shastras, which have a religious element to them, would go along with this kind of an understanding of the duality of that which is formless and that which is given a form, and that where a certain kind of symbolization provides meaning, provides attributes, and provides features to that particular deity who is given a form. So very, very important ideas that were probed by Stella Kramrish and Kumaraswamy, which continue to be of great importance today. However, subsequently, or even at the time that Kramrish was writing in the 50s and 60s, a large number of scholars began to critique this kind of an understanding of art merely in terms of the spiritual element, merely in terms of the kinds of attributes and philosophies and meanings, all of it being important, but also needing to go beyond that. And for instance, in the work of Kumaraswamy, where the seminal essay of his called The Dance of Shiva, he talks about the Panchakritya of Shiva, and this is particularly in relation to that Chola bronze that we have, which everybody would know across the Indian subcontinent and perhaps outside, That bronze image of an Ananda Tandava where Shiva is dancing with one leg lifted up and with his hands in the Abhaya Mudra and the Gajahasta, and you have this fire, this ring that encompasses this figure of Shiva, the Tiruvashi, and it's an extremely beautiful piece of art, and you have a number of these bronzes that were cast particularly in the Chola period. And so Kumaraswamy studies this particular bronze image and tries to look at the textual material that is available, looks at the Mantra Marga tradition of Tantric Shaivism, looks at Puranic Shaivism, looks particularly at the Shaiva Siddhanta tradition, and focuses on how the Panchakritya is associated with the dance of Shiva. And what are these 5 great acts that are associated? They are Srishti or creation, they are Sthiti or maintenance, Samhara or destruction, Tirobhava or disappearance or concealment, Anugraha or grace. And further, that one who contemplates, for the Shaiva Siddhantin, one who contemplates these would be destroying Maya or illusion, Mala or impurity, and karma, the bonds of karma or causality would be broken. So these are very, very important, interventions, important ways in which you study art, the doors being thrown open by these pioneers like Kumaraswamy. But if one were to look at this a little more critically, then you have a number of other scholars who have worked on dance. For instance, Shivaramamurthy. Shivaramamurthy's work on Nataraja in the Indian traditions is one which is really taking this very, a long kind of look at the textual tradition. He's also looking at the many regional traditions and trying to compare them and so on. But really a major kind of intervention in terms of trying to decode the meanings of the Nataraja figure comes in the work of scholars like David Smith or like David Schulman. And I think in my own work on Tamil Bhakti, inspired both by Kumaraswamy as well as by this tradition of scholarship, I have tried to look at Shiva's dance as it appears in the Shaiva Bhakti tradition, where you have the Bhakti saints, the Nayanmar, who keep talking about Shiva's great dance, the Ananda Tandava, which Kumaraswamy is talking about, but they also talk about other dances of Shiva, where Shiva is dancing actually, in awe of Kali. He's dancing beside her, he is watching her dance, and that he seems to be almost fearful of the dance of Chamunda also in some context. She's sometimes referred to as Kali, sometimes as Chamunda, almost fearful of her dance. And what we find is in the Tamil Bhakti traditions, in the poets' songs as well as in later Bhakti literature, we find an elaboration of this dancing of Shiva along with Kali, where Shiva and Kali are dancing with each other. Shiva is unable to defeat Kali, and what does he do? He then dances this thundering Tandava dance called the Urdhva Tandava, which leads him to raise his foot straight upwards, very clearly a phallic symbol, and through that, he is able to effectively defeat the goddess Kali. And Kali, we are told in these traditions, just stands there, humbled by Shiva, unable to lift her feet up because of feminine inhibition. And so this kind of mythopoeic image, the way in which it conveys certain social ideas, certain patriarchal ideas, certain notions of conformity to behavior types, behavior patterns, this is something that we can also read when we look at this kind of mythology. So clearly the scope of the study of art by historians has widened. We have brought in newer newer ways of looking at art. Not to say that the philosophical dimensions or the literary dimensions are not important, but to read the literary evidence more in sync with the kind of social changes, the social traditions, certain kinds of normative traditions that are sought to be established through religious ideas, through social codes, through the Varnashrama Dharma. These are the ways in which increasingly scholars have begun looking, as I also have done in earlier work. In this particular book, Art and History, the primary aims and objectives, therefore, have been to look at historical context, to look at the ancient and early medieval period in particular, although it's very difficult really to restrict ourselves when the kinds of sources we have themselves spill over. So the Purans, even if we are talking about the Mahapurans, not to mention the Upapurans, they would certainly spill over into the medieval period. But largely the bulk of these are composed in the ancient and early medieval periods, and the Purans become a very, very important source. The epic traditions, the Sanskrit epic traditions, as well as other kinds of epic traditions such as the Tamil ones and so on, become also important when we're looking at literary sources. Very, very important literary sources that we tend to make use of are the Shilpa Shastras. There are Pratima Lakshanam chapters, chapters devoted to iconography and how to make images in the Purans themselves. The Purans are particularly important with regard to mythologies. And in fact, in that previous instance that I was citing about the goddess and Shiva's dance, you do have an allusion to this myth even in the Puranic tradition, but how it is actually taken and transformed in the Tamil traditions is what I had focused upon. So similarly, in this volume, we have tried to look at these kinds of transformations, these kinds of descriptions that exist, and analyze the kinds of changes that actually come about over a period of time. And a very important element in this kind of discussion is the importance of ideology, the importance of political ideology, religious ideology, and so on. And there are 5 themes in this book. And they are visualizing power, conceptualizing the divine feminine, religious traditions, visual representations, and regional context, and social imaginaries and the ocular. And the 5th is prescriptions and representations. And there are 15 essays which focus on different regional contexts, different political contexts, and different religious contexts, which try to piece together the kinds of art that existed, that was produced in a particular context, and the manner in which these get understood, the context in terms of patronage, and also the context in terms of how we can read meanings in terms of the time period for which these were made. I will stop there. And I will hand over to the moderator, to Dr. Swapna Liddle. I apologize if I've taken a little more time than I should have.
Thank you so much, Mahalakshmi. This was, I having read the book, of course, I do appreciate all that, your lovely introduction to it, and what the essays are in the book, and how they deal with a very, with a range of themes, and putting these ideas into the practice as such. And without any further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Lal to give his the benefit of his impressions on this. So, Professor Lal, up to you. You will need to unmute yourself.
It's not there in my hand.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. Okay. I think you have been unmuted now by.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can I? So let me begin by giving an idea of what is there in the book for us. and what is it that makes this book special? And I mean, when I first looked at the title of the book, I thought this may be yet another collection of essay on aspect of art history. And this was a little surprising to me, considering the kind of work Mahalakshmi has been doing. But then once I started reading through the essay, I realized that beyond this apparent simplicity of the title, the diverse essay that goes into the making of this volume engages with the important issues which have rarely been concern of historians of art. They not only manages to expand the boundary of art history, but also throws fresh insight as to how to reach visual art to bring out the context and also the different layers of larger processes of history. The essay all firmly grounded in the sources of different types, located in different context, time, and space, encompassing a wide range of theme, brings out the important issue of how the data on visual representation can be used both as a source and signifier, and how it can further be illuminated through a range of textual, epigraphic, and other material. This is possibly the central concern that seemed to have structured the entire edited collection of the essay on art and history. Now, as Mahalakshmi pointed out, there are 15 essays in the book, which has been organized under 5 specific themes. But before we come to that specific rubric, I think the uh, uh, introduction of the book, which is organized under different sub rubrics by the editor, needs to be discussed a little. Now, here she offers a critical review of recent historiography on art history, highlighting the way in which people considered visual representations, evaluated art, and often tracked the genealogy of artwork in artists over time. By citing some of the recent work, she has argued how the historiography of art history has quite often infiltrates, intermingles, and also blurs the boundary of the history of other disciplines. In the process of discussion, she also brings in the argument of the scholars like Samuel Parker, Professor Romila, Devangna Desai, and others to underline the importance of looking at the artist as a creator, particularly of religious images, looking at art as a cultural transaction in the form of catalyst under several circumstances, and also how different context would result in different categories of patterns which inevitably affect the nature of art production. In the process, he also brings in a well thought out discussion on issues relating to research methodology to explore this sort of sources, which I'm very sure is going to be very, very useful for the future researcher. Now, I'll not get into the content of the book because this would take time, and I have been told that I do not have to exceed beyond 10 minutes. At least I am hit by a pop-up message. So I'll just state, but then that would be a repetition. So I just leave out. Now, in totality, if one looks at the essay, one is also struck by the thematical pluralities, variety of visual representation used, located in different time and space, and also the differing ideational positions of the contributor. However, one must argue that despite these diversities, there is a common thread that runs all along, which unifies them as one useful text on art history. There is a commonality and the commonality of concern is defined by the set of issues that they all have tried to address in some form or other. They all invariably dwells on the significance of visual representations in a specific regional historical context, the range of symbolic significance attached to these, and the mythological and textual prescriptions that contribute to the codifications and the use of representational form. Now, this only goes on to reflect how carefully selections of paper have been made by the editor, and I'm very sure that must not have been an easy job. However, it is this which also makes it an extremely worthwhile collection. The collection, I mean, overall, try to break the boundaries of the conventional historiography of what has generally been described as the study of art, in which visual representations are treated at best as supplementary sources having no real significance on historical context. Now, the book manages to bring together diverse form of visual representations, idea analysis, drawing largely upon the insights offered by recent historians of art history. It does open up a new window of entry into the area that has traditionally been neglected by historians. The work hopefully would be a valuable addition to the craft of essay writing, at least in charting a course which would lead to a better understanding of visual representations in the analysis of historical context. And also, I think this book would decidedly lead to the reorientation of historian gaze to the visual representations that we have of different point of time. I mean, this is about the book, and then I would rest my case here. The if I'm allowed, I would like to discuss some of the paper which are certainly worth discussing. Do we have the time?
Couple of minutes, please.
I mean the in the first section possibly the one essay by Sushandra Ghosh. I mean this the power of image and image of power in the Indo-Iranian borderland, a case study of Bactrian Greek and the Indo-Greek folk. This is an extremely well essays where the numismatic evidence, representation on numismatics has been used, how they have been used as some kind of medium of communication of a particular kind of image. And that is how the royalties are trying to bring. But the three of the essays, which is there in the second one, by three of the young scholars, which deals with just a second, I think I have lost somewhere, but that is Prerna and others. That is certainly where she's trying to get into the psychological part or the psychohistory of the how to unravel the psychohistory of their sculpture. That is certainly something very, very interesting and new, and I must congratulate them for the rich empirical evidence and the theoretical framework which they have brought in to bring out such an important aspect of visual arts. So my takeaway is, the final takeaway is, which I said earlier, this book would certainly lead to reorientations of historians' gaze on visual art. And obviously, the future researcher would make use of it to contribute further. There is enough in the book for the young researcher to take up.
Thank you very much, Professor Lal. Yes, I agree completely that there is this book has opened up areas of inquiry which others will also, I think, benefit from taking forward, and we look forward to more historians taking up themes like this in their own way in other areas. Now I will request Professor Basant to give us his impressions of the book. Professor Basant, over to you.
Thank you, Swapna, and thank you, Shyam Narayan. Since the speakers have made my job easier by going into the details of the presentations that the book has made, so I'll make some general comments. Books on art with glossy covers and beautiful pictures have generally confused historians. They don't quite know where to place them in their narratives. From the 19th century onwards, Impressive volumes were produced on art history. They would describe in great detail various features of paintings or images. There were fascinating comparisons of art traditions of India and the West. Yet the narratives seem to be struck in some metaphysical discourse. Works of art seem to convey one universal meaning, and all that art historians needed to do was to describe in great detail various features of the particular work of art as such. This positivist obsession had the great quality of creating a vast world of knowledge about works of art. That was believed to be the objective picture. Art historians were lost in discovering the oeuvre of the Indian art using a diction that seemed incomprehensible to historians. Aesthetics, or that wow feeling that one has on seeing a great work of art, was something that was non-quantifiable. While scholars were busy classifying works of art, a remarkable book appeared, Partha Mittar's Much Maligned Monsters. The importance of this book is in the fact that we were used to the idea that images conveyed just one meaning. What he showed was that the images that we consider very beautiful and profound in the Indian tradition today turned out to have been regarded as ugly monsters by many European travelers in 16th and 17th century. It suddenly destabilized the idea of creating an objective history of art. If the moderns could look at works of art differently, surely one could attempt a history of seeing. Suddenly, Walter Benjamin became relevant. One could ask who saw these works of art and what did they see? Among works by historians, the writings of Dedi Koshambi stand apart. With his X-ray vision, he was able to see the continuities from the worship of aniconic lumps of stone to well-defined images. He connected these art traditions to communities along a graded hierarchy. So foragers or pastoralists could make do with aniconic forms. However, he also noticed that the life of images, he noticed the life of images beyond the context of creation by primitive groups. Such images had a valence for people who otherwise were parts of modern economic systems. However, historians generally ignored aesthetics. They sat down to create what they believed was a social history of art. So an Ajanta painting became simply part of a dense network of patronage, trade routes, and other such terms familiar to historians. They could calculate how much of stone had to be transferred over how much of distance, but art and aesthetics were gone. Standard books of history would have a chapter on art and architecture appended to the main narrative of history. History and art rarely talk to each other. We need to ask ourselves, what is art history giving us in addition to the information already found in the body of historical texts? So, an intervention by Professor Mahalakshmi and other co-authors should be welcome, where there is an attempt to find a madhyam marg. I cannot discuss individual pieces. However, examples can be culled from writings of Professor Mahalakshmi, Niharika Sankrityan's work also. Uh, for example, they describe a large number of gods and goddesses in their explorations. We need to imagine many of the gods and goddesses as having existed as local deities earlier. Such pathways of transition from folk tradition to greater tradition need to be explored. The study of village deities carved in crude manner on stone probably gives us an entry into the world on the margins of the Brahmin system. Modern studies indicate that almost every village and household has a god or goddess of its own who might be significantly different from those of the great tradition. For example, in my ancestral household in North Bihar village, The god for whom lamps were lit morning and evening was an aniconic image called Sokha Baba. In the village, the most important deity was a mother goddess identified with Durga. This was a typical North Bihar village with its divisions of caste and class. However, the priest for the goddess temple was an outcast. Obviously, this temple was the product of a long process of coexistence of local and greater traditions. Possibly such trends prevailed in most of India. Scholars have talked about emergence of regional traditions with Quranic practices. The important question will be if many communities, households, villages were coexisting in this chaotic world of beliefs, what changed to create a regional tradition? History of art might provide answers to some of these questions. In that tradition of work, much needs to be done. When we contextualize lives of images and artworks, we need to underline clear strategies. For example, we could reverse the gaze and ask what were the images and artworks looking at? How do the Saatchi artists imagine Bodh Gaya? A text and an image might belong to the same region and yet belong to local and greater traditions. Uh, I suppose I stop here. I have probably consumed my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Basant, for your ideas on this. Yes, it is indeed very true that we will have to look, and there are some essays in the book which definitely deal with this idea of how local traditions, how greater traditions, how these really interact and how they are reflected in the kind of art that is produced. Before we go any further, I would like to actually ask Professor Mahalakshmi to give us an idea of the contributors. If you can hear me,
Yeah.
Mahalakshmi, and I think you are on mute, so if you would like to unmute yourself,
Yes.
or there you go.
Yes. Thank you so much. May I actually just go back to my slide, because that would just be very simple in terms of flagging the different essays by particular scholars. The first theme, as I mentioned earlier, is on visualizing power, sacred and temporal. And the first essay here is by Suchandra Ghosh on the power of image and image of power, which was mentioned by Professor Shyam Narayan Lal. She's looking at the Indo-Iranian borderlands. This is a very important and interesting area because of the flow of people, of ideas, the kind of expansion of polities in this region and from this region into the subcontinent. So an extremely important region. And she looks at the coins of the Bactrian Greeks and the Indo-Greeks, and particularly talks about the way in which there is self-representation of the rulers, as well as the use of motifs which are common to the Greek tradition, but which also have parallels with the Indic tradition. So you do have, therefore, certain kinds of representations of the Greek deities, Greek gods and goddesses, but you also have what appear to be the local traditions coming in when you have representations of the wheel, of the plow, and so on, very clearly, connected to the Vrishni heroes who we are getting to know of in the epic traditions. The second essay in this theme is by Dev Kumar Jhanj. It is on, again, coins. Here, looking at a particular kind of coin called the Abhiraka coin, and is focusing on this particular non-monarchical polity of the Abhiras and how they are able to claim an identity for themselves through the issue of these coins. And he engages with a lot of other scholarship, which has tried to attribute this coin to other dynasties, monarchies, and so on. The third essay by Niharika Sankritan is on the Charukya temples of at Badami. And here she's looking at the Brahmanical iconography in particular, but she's also looking at this iconography, as more than being representations of the Puranic deities Shiva and Vishnu, based on the mythologies of these deities, that these also reflect the kind of ideas about power, the conceptualization of power, because of specific forms that are being chosen for display. And in my own essay, which is on controlling the waters, divine imagery and royal enterprise in early medieval Tamil Nadu, I look at the images of Shiva as Gangadhara Murti, holder of Ganga in the matted locks of his hair, and look at the mythology as it appears in the epics, and look at the Tamil Bhakti traditions which talk about this particular myth, and also the visual material from the Pallava Pandya and from the Chola period in particular. Because the argument here is about how important water and control over water is to the political powers, and how through such an imagery and through the insistence on such an imagery in all the Chola temples after a period of time, there seems to be an evocation of this idea for the ruler as much as it is for the deity, the importance of controlling the waters. And in the second theme, we have the works of Sneha Ganguly, Megha Yadav, and Virender Singh Bittu on Kali in the Shaiva traditions, Pragya Paramita in the Buddhist traditions, and the Mahavidyas in the Jaina traditions, three different kinds of goddesses, or in the case of the Mahavidyas, a group of goddesses, and how they are represented in these three different traditions, the importance of the religious tradition, the religious text, but also looking at the symbolic assertions that are being made through such kind of imagery. The third theme, which is on religious traditions, visual representations, and regional context, is also has three essays by V. Selvakumar on religious landscape of northern Tamil Nadu, by Umakant Mishra on Jajpur in Odisha, particularly looking at the way in which a region that was known as the Viraja Tirtha, the goddess Viraja, the Tirtha to that particular goddess's home, how it gets transformed as a place that is special to Lord Vishnu as Nabhi Gaya. And he looks at the way in which these changes occur in Jajpur. And in Shayantani Pal's work, the focus is on this particular monastic site in Bihar called Katihar, a very important site. A large number of inscribed images have been found. And she looks at the donors to that monastery and talks about how there is actually a spatial spread of this monastic institutions hold, in the sense that people from South India and from other parts were coming to this particular place. In the fourth theme, we have social imaginations and the ocular, in which three essays focus on Shiva as Kalyana Sundaramurti. This is by Neha Singh, where she looks at this particular image called Kalyana Sundaramurti, and looks at the textual traditions which talk about the importance of marriage, different kinds of marriages, what are considered auspicious and inauspicious, particularly in a day and time when we would think we are beyond social prescriptions about marriage. It's an essay of great relevance for our times, really, because it talks about how Brahmanical prescription on whom you should marry comes about, and how this figure of Shiva and Parvati as Kalyana Sundaramurti is considered the epitome of the perfect couple. And then you have Sujata Rakshit's essay on erotic imagery in Odisha temples, Malavika Bini's essay is on men, stones, and stories, revisiting the miracles of South India. So how the way in which masculinity, heroism is inscribed and is represented through these memorial stones that are set up in different parts of South India. And the last theme is on prescriptions and representations. And here we have Anisha Saxena, who has an essay on the Kirti Mukha, very, very interesting architectural motif, which finds its place across monuments in South Asia, be they Brahmanical Shaiva Vaishnava monuments, be they Buddhist monuments or monuments. And we have also the essay by Professor Yashadatta Alone, which is on the Buddhist theory of representation, a very, very important essay which draws our attention to theorists like Dignaga, to Nagarjuna, to Asanga, and to others, to show how important the philosophy of the Buddha is, the philosophical dimensions are in terms of understanding the way in which forms are given to the Buddha, to the Bodhisattvas, and to other figures in the Buddhist tradition. So without these wonderful contributions, this book would not have been what it is. I may confess that I am actually very, very proud of this volume. And I thank everybody today who has spoken here for being very appreciative, but also for flagging some issues which possibly need to be probed further. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions here. So if you could quite quickly look at them. One is from Vishnu Saxena, and he says, how do the classical Indian perceptions of art, especially dance, differ from Western perceptions? If you could just answer that very quickly, because we are running out of time.
Well, I have a manuscript in progress on dance in early Indian traditions, and really I'm looking at South India in particular, but I will be looking at the textual traditions which have a relevance across the subcontinent. And certainly, you know, especially if one talks of South India, the importance of dance is so visible when you visit any monument, where you see in the sculptural traditions also, you know, so many dancing figures. And in fact, in every part of the subcontinent where you have rich iconography, whether it is Central India or Eastern India, Odisha in particular, this is something that is quite visible to us. Certainly a lot of material that is available to us. There's a wonderful work by Kapila Vatsyayan on dance in the Indian traditions, where she does go into this particular aspect of differentiating between what we could talk of as an Indian dance tradition or Indian understanding of dance and the performative arts. And I think that that's a very good starting point, really, to talk of the differences between the Western and the Indian traditions. But I think even in the Western traditions, many scholars have drawn our attention to the fact that there is it appears enough evidence to suggest that religious religious offerings or religious cultic context may have been the place where you have a lot of the dance forms that actually originated. You also have other kinds of dance traditions which relate to seasons, celebration of particular kinds of festivities, and so on. That's as true for the Indian traditions as for the Western traditions. So there would be some broad commonalities, but there are also very significant differences. I don't mean to make this into a East versus West kind of discussion, whether one is talking about the performative arts or about the visual arts. But I think that certainly one does need to look at the context.
There is just one last question, and that is from Priyadarshi, and I hope that I can read this out properly. and I'm pronouncing things properly, how the idea of the Brahma Kshatriya is visualized in art of early medieval period. For example, the Sen rulers, is that the Sen rulers were enjoying the epithet of Brahma Kshatriya. How this idea can be looked upon?
Well, this is really out of syllabus, as we say. It's not something that I have thought much about nor looked at specifically. But I think that rather than look at art in terms of representation of the Kshatriya, representation of the Brahmana, as if these are piecemeal things, one needs to look at how a society understands how power is to be conveyed, how social position is to be conveyed. So, for instance, you have iconometric rules that are laid out in the Shilpa Shastras, which tell you about how even when a man and a woman, even when a god and a goddess are to be portrayed, there is an iconometric difference between the male deity and the female one. So the Talamana system that is there is one that clearly gives you this kind of an indication, a social indication of the kind of difference that is perceived between the genders that needs to be portrayed. Similarly, when you look at the descriptions of how an attendant has to be portrayed, how important personages like kings have to be portrayed, there are specific kinds of instructions on how this is to be done. I'm familiar with a couple of texts like Mayamatam and Manasara, and in these, it's very clear, and even in the Vishnu Dharmotar Puran, in several of the chapters, you find this kind of a description. For instance, it says that if you want to show the esteemed people in the city who are part of a procession, so it's talking about how the elites have to be portrayed, a procession has to be shown, and so on. They have to be shown with gray hair. So this is, of course, in the Chitra Lakshana part, which is about painting. But essentially, that kind of thing. So that Gambhiram that is given to them, that seriousness, that aura that they have, is because of that gray hair that they are supposed to have. But there's one more category that's specifically talked of as being shown with gray hair, and that is the widows. So widows are supposed to be shown in, so there are these kinds of descriptions that the text gives us. It's just that we haven't paid enough attention to them. So it's really an important issue to look at how particular kinds of representations find a place both textually as well as in stone or in other material. But I think it's important for us to have an understanding of the context in which this kind of prescription is given and this kind of display is there. There's been a debate for very long in Sri Lanka, in Sigiriya, where you have these beautiful 7th, 8th century caves with paintings on them. And you have a large number of, there's this, it's high up on the hill, it's called the Lion Hill, and you have these images of women taking offerings and going to the to worship. And this is a Buddhist context that we are looking at. It's a monastic context. There's a monastery there. There's also a royal palace over there, which comes up at a later point of time. But what is interesting is some of these figures of the women are golden complexioned and some are dark complexioned. So are we looking at two different categories of people represented there? Or are we just looking at people who may belong to the same class who have, different colors, who are of who look different from each other? So these are interesting questions. We need to raise them, but I'm not very sure we're going to get exact answers when we actually look at art and try to place these kinds of questions, which were not really in the minds of the artists at that point of time. I don't think that they were always in the minds of the artists.
Right. Thank you for your answers. I think we have dealt with the audience questions that we have had right now. So it's been a very pleasant afternoon spent with the insights of all of this, and we all really look forward to the book and looking to look at all the different essays. And of course, as I said, it has opened up the field to many more explorations along these lines, and will be a thought-provoking read, I'm sure, for all of us, all of you, as it has been for us. It remains for me to thank the program department of the India International Center, which has made this webinar, this discussion possible. To our speakers today, of course, Professor Mahalakshmi, who edited this book as well, to Professor Lal, who gave us his ideas, and Professor Basant, who talked about the book as well, and his impression of it. I would also like to thank the technical team who have made this easy for us. It's not always very easy. I myself, without unbeknownst to you all, got logged out a couple of times because my power went. So these are things that happen to all of us. But I'm very, very grateful that this has that they have enabled this to go on in such a smooth manner. Thank you, all of us. Thank you to all of them. And I'm to the audience who have joined in today, and those who will be watching this also as it comes up on YouTube. So thank you very much all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.